Okay, so this is the reproduction and meaning section of the second lecture on Teotihuacan. And it's just about reproduction and images and really to talk about how we experience art history. Um, a lot of times in the past, we go to a lecture, it's dark, it's relaxing, and we see images and we maybe fall asleep. And and especially with the older art history, the focus ends up being on iconography a lot of the time. And that's like a traditional memory of it, and a lot has changed for the better. um, so why was the focus on iconography, and what is this experience of reproductions? And let's just tease that apart a little bit. That's all I'm doing here. Like I said in the introduction, in these three slides I've got Michelangelo on the right, the Sistine Chapel. And after it was painted, it was decided that it was too risque, and years later the clothes were added to this female figure in the left foreground, and you can see the color difference, and that gives it the Sistine Chapel. Once you look at it and see the censorship and the changes in how it came about, it starts to look more and more like a collage kind of situation, which lends it, which makes it kind of interesting. But the point is that these a lot of the works we look at have gone through phases of renovation, and a lot of times that renovation is not really talked about, right? Who did it? Who painted it? And why aren't they added to the list of artists in a way? And how much did they change it? And are they just kind of um, silent authors, right? Ghost writers to these pieces that end up being part of our canon? So that's one thing I want to talk about with Teotihuacan, right? Because a lot of these pieces have been restored, and finding out how they've been restored and what kind of color was changed, it can be difficult. And I think it's important because the effects of the restoration affects the trust and how much we decide to look at certain ideas, right? We're not going to pay attention to brushstroke if it's been repainted by somebody, or are we? And what could the repainting tell us about the original? And could it maybe tell us more than the original, because we're seeing these layers of of whatever was important to each culture that then restored it, right? Whatever the was hip for restoration, and we're seeing different styles of restoration, and that's fascinating, right? Of what was decided to keep, what's important that somebody was looking at. Then in the middle, I have and this is a perfect example of the labyrinth of figuring out the original and how we're going to deal with that with art history in the future and now, especially with AI. So this is a photoshopped, filtered image of a copy, right? A painted copy that exists in the Ciudad de Mexico in the Museum of Anthropology, of fragments of an original mural that had been restored. So this is a game of telephone, and we have to decide what kind of trust and how we're going to deal with an artwork as it changes through time. And then on the left, we have the classic Richard Prince, kind of artist from the 70s, dealing with photography and the rephotographing group of artists. And I'm just putting that here to deal with the idea that we live in the age of the simulacra, and we are inundated with images, photos of photos of photos of images. And so how we decide to deal with the original is real. That's we exist in that time, right? Has the photo been flipped? Is it black and white? Is that actually what the person said? Has this soundbite been clipped? What is the context? Yeah, so that's the topic here that I want to get at. Um, so let's just go through these slides a little bit. Yeah, so like often it's a black and white. There's in the art historical like books, and the way they show images and try to learn about a piece of artwork is they make these kind of very clear black and white line drawings that can show us the iconography, and then can be put in papers and texts, and so that's one example. For example, so that's a line drawing of, I mean, it's of this artwork, which is a copy of the original. So that's a layer of complication. And this is a picture of a copy of the original. This is a photo filter on the original fragment. This is a photo filter on a painting that exists on the wall. And then this is from somebody's study where they're trying to figure out if it's wolves or coyotes that the Teotihuacan's painted. And so you have the typical black and white style that promotes clarity, and then you have a more colored style, maybe I don't know, some kind of in between to help us see what's happening with this deer that these two animals are holding. And then on the upper left, we have someone's supposed rendition of how the colors may have looked at some time of day before they had faded, maybe. A little unclear on what or the precision of that model is. So this is just a spread of the complications we're dealing with, and it's not just with Teotihuacan, it's with any group of artworks that we try to understand. So let's get into it a little bit here. So Atatelco, the amazing compound Atatelco on the left, that is an existing structure, an older photo, but it's this beautiful two buildings that we've talked about. One has a red on white field painting, and the other building has the white on red field. And then here on your right, you have the recreation in a museum. So, is it necessary to go to the space to experience them? What are the differences? I'm just throwing these questions out to consider for ourselves as we, it's a topic of art history. So on the right, you have Tepantitla Patio 2, and this incredible mural that comes from there. And then on the left, you have the recreation where it has been filled in. Interestingly, the bottom left of the recreation leaves the sections out, right? Like this shape matches this shape. And probably in here we can find this shape, but they didn't do that with the upper field. I'm not sure why. I haven't been able to find out the exact process of this recreation. And here are the right and left reproductions of that particular Patio 2 painting. So this is a close-up of these two. Here is a close-up of the original Patio 2 painting on the right, next to the recreated painting. And I'll just zoom in here a little bit. So you can see the color and the line quality of this piece of art compared to something like this. Here on the right, we have the a photograph of the original that has clearly been. This is also Patio 2, but it's to the right. It's the right wall. We also have some kind of restoration process, right? Some kind of cleaning, and maybe even color touch up. So when I was in high school, I interned with a art restorer, and we cleaned paintings and repaired rips. And that was the first time I saw kind of, you think of this artwork as this stable object, and the museum apparatus and art history often kind of lends itself towards that, right? It needs to be solid to be traded and maintain its value or whatever its profit trajectory is. But when I was restoring these paintings with this gentleman, and we weren't doing museum pieces, we were doing people's heirlooms and things that were handed down, they had in their homes that were important to them. And we would wash them, and I would watch the color change, and like maybe he was he was ailing at the time, and maybe we washed them a little bit too much, and the colors would fade, and we would have a different painting in the end, in my opinion. Or the classic kind of old school restoration thing is you put a varnish on, and it's a very shiny, slick varnish. And so how does that change the overall effect of these images that we're looking at? And what I want to say is we have to decide how sensitive, how close a read do we want to give these? And that's a big part of talking about this is when we imagine that they've been changed so much that actually like the black and white rendition is going to give us the information that we need, then we can't talk about line quality, we can't talk about color. There's all of this beautiful art information that is going to get sucked out of what these things are. And so if we can't deal with these gaps in time, of how to pay attention to the sensitivity of the way they're made, right? If we decide to relegate to just kind of like say, well, it's been changed in lots of ways, we don't really know what it looked like, um, we're going to miss out on a huge cultural treasure that we have as humans with all of these artworks. Um, Lascaux is an incredible example of this situation. When I was younger, I went to Lascaux and I went to the cave paintings, and I didn't have a firm art historical base. I loved drawing and making artwork, and I was a studio art um, student. And on the right, I think this is in a museum, or I'm not, or maybe this is in the Lascaux Museum. On the left, you can see the fact that a lot of a lot of people don't know. Lascaux, 10,000, I don't even know, 10,000, 20,000 BC, these cave paintings were made, and they were discovered by some people, and they've recreated the entire Lascaux in fiberglass a couple miles from the real place, because humans were destroying it with the air that we breathe and sweat and touching and whatever. So no one's allowed in Lascaux. So we have these reproductions, and then the reproductions get photographed. And so my favorite book of Lascaux paintings, I can't even figure out if they're paintings of the fiberglass reproduction made by some artists or if they're photographs of the original paintings, right? It's not talked about. Like, so that's also something that's interesting. There's a lot of it's not transparent what was the original in a lot of the images that we have disseminated. And so that speaks even more to what I'm getting at, which is like, if we have a skill set that allows us to discern things about a culture from the past and about what it means to be human, including line quality and color and these things they're difficult to talk about, and they haven't been forefronted in art historical language as having real impact. And part of it has to do with, this is my kind of thesis here, with these layers of manipulation after the fact. So when I went to Lascaux, I cried. I drew from the paintings and I cried, and I forgot. I had a real emotional experience that this was a fabrication of the original. And that's something that's a very poignant thing to consider in our age of digital VR. And last year I wanted to look up a basketball game, and I ended up watching close to 5 minutes of someone playing a realistic video game of a basketball game and getting excited before I realized that this was a manipulation played before the game to see, who could win, by a bunch of friends who were playing basketball on the computer. So I'm just talking about the degree to which we're taken with an art object, and how to deal with that. This is a great quote here. So I think The people who painted Lascaux, only one person from the whole team was actually allowed to go there. So the copies are made completely from images and stories. The sense of an emotive, right? So this is also an idea about transcription and the reality of transcription and you know, the idea that if it looks with your eyes, if it looks exactly like it from some angle, that you are reproducing it, that it is that thing. But to anyone who has spent years drawing and painting, we know that this curve and this space are going to feel different, um, based on who copies it and what particular things they're looking at. There's just too much to deal with here to express this on a three-dimensional surface. Um, but then again, that's also like a romantic notion. Of course, these could be exactly reproduced with digital technology. We could reproduce them exactly. So that's a big change in world history, right? Um, this person says that's why this replica is almost more real than the real cave, because it has the original hole the boys climbed through. So there's even the notion that this thing is more real than the original, which I can buy. I can buy that. So when it comes to Teotihuacan, on the left is a manipulated Adobe photo software by myself of the replica that's in the Anthropological Museum in Ciudad de Mexico, and it's an awesome image. It's crazy. It's really um, it's super striking. And but what I'm getting at, okay, and then on the right, this is the restored original that was in the building in the slide I showed. And so what I'm trying to talk about here is the line quality. I think that this is the original, these spots, and that this is all recreated in some way. Uh, this is all made by somebody else, but it helps us to see it, right? But is there something that can be gained about color and line quality? Not really. Maybe. I mean, if we look at even if we look at these lines here, right? Hash marks are a wonderful thing to think about, from Raphael to Michelangelo to throughout our history, right? These accrual of accumulations of small marks to represent value or a different color field. It's a technique, but you can see in it, it's a moment where the mind can wander, or also where the apprentice, or if it's a group of people making this mural painting, gets that job. And you can see when somebody's talking about something else and they're just filling in, versus how much each mark matters, right? What kind of meditative moment that is, and whether it's a mark that's going to show a form or whether it's just a pattern. And so there's things to learn and to see from looking at something like that. So I'm just helping to give a close read. This form, for example, I don't know why it's giving a hand. I guess it's because it'd be better if I'm not zoomed in, I guess. Hold on a sec. So yeah, this curve here would be a prime place for a close read in the Teotihuacan iconography. The degree to which we decide to let that turn in three-dimensional space or be flat. So this is getting very in the weeds for an introductory course, but I just wanted to kind of talk about how you can learn different things if we decide to trust what is in front of us. This is a black and white version of the original wall. So sure, we can just look at all these shapes and say, you know, they're geometric, they're angular, they're made up of triangles with kind of an amoeba shape, and what could that mean? And was that repeated in different places? And kind of do an iconographic breakdown. But my interest is more of the hand and the touch and the way that it was made and what that can mean about a society. And so my point is, how much can I use those skills to look at something like this? Um, yeah, so the line quality in something like this is very different. If we just look at, I have a good slide actually that compares this and the color. This kind of heightened acidity of the viridians, of the greens with the blues, right? The reproductions that you see, the painted facsimiles that you see, they play with that acidity, that classic viridian, we call it, feel of different colors. Um, and but they play with it in a very different way, right? It's not, it does not look like this at all. And so this is a special lens with which to look at Teotihuacan art and the way they thought about color to actually see this. And as an art historian, you might come upon this image quite quickly. But as a in the museums and for the public, you never get to see this. You never get to see this subtle difference that exists. And I think that's a travesty in some way, but it's also, this is what we see. And so this color is very different, and so is the line quality. And I just want us to pay attention to that for a minute and decide for yourselves, like, does that matter to you? Is that something that you need to pay attention to as a student of the world, as somebody who looks at things? Do you care how different? And the next slide really helps us understand. But basically, and this gentleman did a lot of work, and they're amazing. They're incredible images. I love them, right? But there is a tremendous difference in sensitivity. And I guess my, the banner I'm waving here is, let's not lose track of that, right? The way in which these objects hang or fall or have weight or don't is very specific. And I think having a sensitivity to that is unique to our human ability. So it's fun to sweat that a little bit, to use that, right? You can even see, like, there's a slightly more angular moment here. The hand is not drawn in the same way as this is. The idea of like a graphic quality. The outline is heavier, is more heavy-handed. In this case, now this is this typical turn that I'm talking about. So how did this artist understand that? It doesn't exist that way here at all, right? So a turn in space has ramifications about the cognitive ability of the artist. These twists that this artist understood quite easily, they exist here. But let's look at that. How are those different? How do the twists of this plant as it moves up this space behave differently? And do you get, can we learn something different, more, by having the original, which isn't even the original, right? I don't know the degree to which the cleaning and the restoring of this has changed this object. But I will say that this tells me a lot more. There's a very specific feel to the way that's represented, compared to this has a much more rubbery, loopy feeling than the structure of this. This has a much more geometric, and that's interesting. These stars, I'm pretty sure in the original, the stars are very interesting in the Teotihuacan iconography. But here's another slide I've made to help kind of deal with the specificity of this problem. One fun thing to think about is like the Blue Note recordings, the classic jazz recordings from, is it the 60s or the 50s? Like John Coltrane or Thelonious Monk, they have the vinyl. When you listen to them on vinyl, you get that crackly thing, right? And so people like to appropriate that and use that on modern music. And so what I'm getting at here is this, the filter and the of the recording moment, the what do you say, the aesthetic of the recording moment plays a part in our digestion of the material, right? And so this rendition in the City of Mexico Museum is interesting in terms of that, right? It's a remix. These are remixes of the works, and we live right now in a land of remixes. So I think it's really fun to think about it that way. Art history is a series of remixes in a lot of ways. So let's move forward here with the idea of the stages of renovation. And this is the Atelco piece I'm talking about, and this is uh, a photo filter on the facsimile that's in the museum, and it's a remix, right? And so I guess for some reason I just keep bringing us to the turn moment and the hash marks rather than, I guess, because rather than the iconography, it might be easier to deal with, right? Like, so the personality of the figure or the anthropomorphism, that's another thing. Like, there's a different kind of anthropomorphism in the original, or at least in this restored original, than in and that's really fun to talk about, right? So, how is this animal form metamorphosized or anthropomorphized differently? That's a very subtle thing to consider. Michelangelo is the classic example, which I showed in the original slide of renovation. Here's the original part I mentioned of the clothes changing. These look like new clothes. I can't remember all the places, but it gets even more kind of hilarious in its changes. So this is an example of a cleaned Michelangelo painting. What do I have here? So how many times can people go through having a facelift without their poor faces looking like an orange peel? So that's a good point. So this is the cleaning and this is the original. Uh, yeah, this is what the original painting had before clothes were put on the object. Um, and then it gets, here you have these were all added later, this clothing. And here was like, it was just too insane. This snake was biting this man's genitals, and they decided that was too much to show. Um, so I'm just trying to think if there's anything I'm missing about kind of restoration. I guess it's just like somebody in class recently was like, "Yeah, the color was really different in that painting," and that's exactly why I'm having this section is yes. So are you going to appreciate it for its color? Or are you going to say, no, I can't look at this. I don't know what it used to look like. I don't know what the original is. Um, so we bring this all the way to our modern era and Andy Warhol on the right and Richard Prince on the left, and the idea of reproducibility and the image and the simulacra. And this is a big topic for contemporary art history, but I think it's really fun to relate that um, to Teotihuacan and to art history in general. Um, guess I'll just read this. Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg, and soon Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, and others complicated modernism's claims of artistic authorship and authenticity by turning to popular and often banal subjects drawn from mass culture and producing works that mimicked and often exploited commercial modes of production. This depersonalization and mechanization of art's form and content did more than simply complicate the claims of authorship and authenticity so dear to high modernist aesthetics. It inserted the idea of the multiple into the once autonomous space of the unique and introduced the plural into the singular in a way that dramatically impacted our conceptual appreciation of these binary terms. What Johns, Warhol, and these other postmodern artists explored, and what Prince's work can in its own way be seen as a climactic expression of is that in post-war American mass culture, the mark of a moment, a gesture, an image, and a person can be removed from its original context and effortlessly, imperceptibly recontextualized and reiterated. And this is a quote from Richard Prince. I've gotten to know Jackson Pollock and painting, abstract painting through images in books. So yeah, I think that's a very fascinating place to take this. This is the state we're in. The Warhol canvases, the images can be said to barely exist. On the one hand, this is part of an overriding interest in the deteriorated image, the consequence of a series of regressions from some initial image of the real world. Here, there's actually a series of images, beginning with the translation of the light reflectivity of a human space into the precipitation of silver. So he just talks about the photographic process and then photographing a photograph and this kind of distance that happens that's part of our human consciousness right now. So that gets a little bit heady, but I think it's prevalent and really important to consider when we think about the cave paintings, when we think about Teotihuacan, and what we're going to do with this plethora of images. I just want to show more of kind of these filters, these black and white filters that are used. You know, the paintings are difficult to see in reality, and a lot of artworks can be difficult. They don't reproduce well. They're meant to be seen and walked around in different lighting, and so the idea of adding a filter makes a lot of sense. To add even more complication to it, like Linda Schiele, I think is how you say her name, she made a lot of these drawings. And when you start to research who actually made these reproductions, these are really generous artists that lent their attention to these works before they changed even more. And this is ink on vellum that she made. I'm not sure if she traced her original drawing or, you know, and this has a lot to do with other topics we've talked about tracing and line quality, and these things become traces of the original. These are other line drawings. I don't think these are by her. These have a different feel. So what's lost? Now we talked a lot. I talked a lot about line quality and color and how some of the figures, right? These are the human representations in Teotihuacan, feel like not like ghosts, but like the armature, the fabric of the vestments, the clothing could kind of shake and move as a spirit moved and carried them, right? Like there's a feeling that it's not affixed, that these things jingle and jangle as somebody walks. And you don't get that same feeling from this rendition. So there's an example that I think could be a lot of people could apply. You know, that's kind of like somewhat quantifiable, that we have an impression that gets lost. Like sure, we lose the red, we lose the color, there's a lot of obvious things. I'm trying to get at like the sensitive things that we may lose, like what kind of anger or violence did this claw have in the original? And you know, what about a different way of approaching copies? Maybe it requires a poem next to it, right? But of course, in the world of science, we will never give poetry a foundation like that. And I guess that's kind of the crux of this section, right? Is poetry fading over time? This is another one of her drawings that I think is really beautiful. In the way it operates as referent and as its own object. And so then lastly, I think I'm going to show simply kind of filters that I've put on some of these to be able to see them, right? Because when I started looking at them, I had trouble seeing them. And so I threw them into Adobe Photoshop and software, and I wanted to see kind of what would happen. So I think a lot of it is about time. I think that you just see things faster in some ways when you put these filters on. So I ended up seeing angularity of this, and then I look back and I'm like, oh, that is a little more angular than I had thought before I put this filter on it. Um, you can kind of see this as a big shape first. Uh, and you can see it linearly first. Now, when I look back here, I'm able to see the way that these shapes kind of hide or become more about layers. Um, so the left is the photo from a book of a fragment that is somewhere in the United States, and on the right is a filter that I put on it. And what are the differences? How does this help us? How does this help us see this image? Or how does it not help us see this image? Um, and how is the poetry different? Again, the subject of this series of talks is really about looking and seeing small differences, and that takes it takes time and it takes an energy that's difficult to come up with. Um, is there a different sense of humor to this piece, just based on the color and line quality that was chosen? Do the plants have more of character? Um, is there something more menacing to this figure? On the right, the left is the photo pretty straight from the book, and on the right we have a manipulation by myself. Um, Here, there's no manipulation. You're just seeing a detail. These are both manipulations of the copy that's in Mexico, that's in the City of Mexico Museum. The left is the manipulation we've been seeing so far that plays on the copy that's in Museum in Mexico. These are both filters on the copy. His name is Viagra, I think. Villagra. So here are two photos that have been manipulated, just simply due to the make of the camera, the quality of the light, and all these sensitive, in some ways we're talking about what's enough, like what is enough of an exactness, right? Like um there's just so much to look at. This is a beautiful mural. Um, maybe it was brighter, maybe it wasn't. This motif comes up, these striations in the masks of Teotihuacan also. I've never noticed the play of the hand almost. The hands are here, but the idea of feathers and hand as being similar. Um, in here you have the procession of these figures. And then here's some filters on them. So, what do we get to see more of or less of due to having the ability to place these filters? I'll just go through the rest of these pretty quickly, and you can pause it if you're watching it. This is an original picture. This is the detail with the original. I'm showing these to show that the exact line quality up close. I don't know how they were restored. This is on site, and then this is on site, and then this is the manipulations. This is more recently renovated, I believe, restored, which is an interesting restoration. Okay, that's it for the section on reproduction and images in an art historical context and with the restoration process and um, kind of this inundation of images that we exist with.